The image that shattered the carefully maintained facade of the modern British monarchy and exposed a ruthless internal power struggle was not a leaked legal dossier, a whispered rumor from a disgruntled courtier, or a sanitized palace press release designed to meticulously manage the public narrative. It was an empty chair, a single highly conspicuous empty chair at a lavish state reception that screamed louder and echoed further than any official statement ever could. Simply because Queen Camilla, the woman who had fought relentlessly for decades to secure her legitimate place beside the monarch, was glaringly absent from it. The devastating reason she was missing from this grand public spectacle was that she had just walked out of a highly classified council meeting where she was officially, formally, and very quietly erased from the royal line of continuity. A move so calculated, absolute, and deeply structural that it completely redefined the future of the institution itself. She was not divorced, she was not stripped of her current royal title, and she was not banished from the physical premises of the palace, but she was separated from the crown's future so thoroughly and completely that every single ounce of influence, every charitable network, and every ounce of soft power she had spent decades meticulously cultivating would essentially evaporate into thin air the exact moment King Charles's reign eventually comes to an end. The wildest and most heartbreaking part of this entire institutional earthquake is that King Charles knew this irreversible decree was coming, having agonized over it in secret for days before she even walked into the room to hear her fate. Before we dive into the exact timeline, the secret meetings, the hidden alliances, and the handwritten notes that led to this unprecedented royal rupture, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a single update on this story as it develops. To truly understand the sheer gravity of this situation, we must look closely at the stifling atmosphere inside that heavily guarded room when the Royal Household Council, which is essentially the behind-closed-doors group of the most senior officials, legal advisors, and top-tier royals who handle urgent, existential institutional matters, had gathered to settle a dispute that had been quietly and dangerously brewing in the shadows for weeks. They were there to confirm, on paper and for the permanent historical record, that Camilla would no longer hold any place whatsoever in the monarchy's future line of institutional continuity, using polite, sanitized palace language to mask a brutally sharp constitutional blade. Breaking down what that specific terminology actually means for her daily life and her ultimate legacy reveals a stark reality. She absolutely stays queen during Charles's reign, retaining the prestigious title, the demanding daily duties, the highly visible public role, the patronages, and all the ceremonial respect that comes with being the reigning king's consort. However, she permanently loses any succession-related authority, any potential role in a hypothetical emergency regency, and every single institutional protection that might have carried her influence beyond her husband's lifetime, meaning her power is strictly and unavoidably tethered to his mortality. This executive order did not end her marriage or physically remove her crown, but it executed something far colder and more systematic. It dictated that absolutely no power linked to her current position could ever be passed down to her children, her extended relatives, her loyal household advisors, or her personal charitable foundation. Her years of grueling public work and image rehabilitation would remain visible in the history books, but absolutely none of it would become a permanent fixture in the operational machinery of the crown moving forward. As the Lord Chamberlain finished reading this devastating multi-page document aloud in the suffocating silence of the council chamber, Camilla did not explode in anger. She did not argue the complex legalities. She did not demand a broader explanation from the nervous officials, and most tellingly, she did not turn to Charles to beg for his ultimate sovereign protection. Instead, with a chillingly composed demeanor born of years enduring public scrutiny, she pushed back her heavy oak chair, calmly removed the official palace briefing folder from her lap, placed it squarely on the polished mahogany table, and walked out while stunned, breathless courtiers watched her exit in absolute, pin-drop silence. In that fleeting, heavy moment right before she crossed the threshold, she turned to Charles and waited for just a single heartbeat, expecting the man she has loved for decades to challenge the ruling, to reject the document, to say her name, to offer some semblance of resistance, or to do something to defend her legacy and their partnership. He did not do any of that. Instead, he simply lowered his eyes to the crisp papers neatly arranged in front of him, and that impossibly small, defeated movement told her what no one in the room had dared to say out loud. He already knew. And he had known long before she ever entered the room to be ambushed by the establishment. Camilla closed the folder with incredibly careful, deliberate hands and said, with a voice devoid of shouting but incredibly heavy with finality, "You have already decided who I am." A line that landed with so much more destructive force than a screaming match ever could, slicing cleanly through the regal atmosphere of the room. She rose completely before the king could even attempt to formulate an inadequate answer, and walked toward the grand double doors with her profound humiliation held securely behind a rigid, aristocratic calm that she had spent years perfecting for the relentless cameras. And here is the specific detail that tells you absolutely everything you need to know about the other major player in the room. Prince William never moved a single muscle. He did not look overtly victorious, he did not smirk, but he certainly did not look shocked or sympathetic either. His absolute stillness suggested deep, strategic preparation, and Charles acutely noticed this chilling lack of surprise from his heir. As the heavy doors securely shut behind his retreating wife, sealing her institutional fate, the Lord Chamberlain discreetly covered a second, highly confidential sealed page with one hand, a hidden document that officially named the specific royals who would immediately inherit every single long-term responsibility and privilege Camilla had just formally lost. Charles finally lifted his heavy gaze, looked directly at his eldest son, and asked a question that broke the stifling tension of the room. "How long have you been preparing this?" That singular question is the ultimate fracture point of this entire saga, revealing that behind the polished palace announcement stood three people bound together by a complex web of love, duty, trauma, and memories that absolutely none of them could ever erase. And tragically, all three of them genuinely believed they were valiantly defending the survival of the monarchy. Camilla viewed the committee's decision as the calculated destruction of absolutely everything she spent decades trying to build, legitimize, and secure against a public that once openly despised her, seeing it as the ultimate betrayal of her lifelong loyalty. Charles saw the brutal ruling as a necessary but agonizing punishment he ultimately failed to prevent because he was paralyzed by the immense weight of the crown and the terrifying prospect of a fractured succession. William saw something entirely different from both of them. A vital, unyielding protective wall built securely around the future of the crown, meant to shield his own impending reign from outside interference and inherited obligations he never asked for. The tragic reality is that only one of them had the ultimate power to determine what the monarchy actually becomes when the dust settles, and that is where this entire narrative becomes incredibly complicated and deeply human. Camilla had spent the better part of 2 decades painstakingly turning mere survival into genuine operational influence, building that influence meticulously through a vast network of charities, strategic household appointments, flawless execution of ceremonial duties, and her constant, undeniable access to the ear of the king. Those roles mattered immensely to her because they provided her with far more than just elevated social status. They gave her a lasting, structural place inside the ancient royal system, establishing a network of loyal people and long-term commitments that were actively supposed to carry her hard-won influence forward into the next generation. The newly signed order threatened to instantly reduce every single hard-won achievement to a mere temporary privilege, something politely accepted and tolerated strictly during Charles's reign, but aggressively denied any permanent, structural place in the crown's future architecture. And that is a uniquely brutal distinction when you deeply analyze the psychology behind it. She could do all the exhausting work, smile endlessly through the tedious public events, support the king through his darkest hours and most challenging crises, and build her charitable legacy from the ground up, but none of it would stick beyond her husband's final breath. It is the equivalent of being explicitly told that your entire life's work, your redemptive arc, and your career have a strict expiration date that is inextricably tied to the heartbeat of someone else, rendering your own individual legacy entirely disposable in the eyes of the institution. William, on the other hand, carried an entirely different, equally heavy burden as the direct heir, the person who is undeniably first in line to inherit the throne and all its accompanying historical baggage and modern crises. He had started ruthlessly examining every single palace promise, contract, and appointment through the unforgiving question of what would actually survive after his father passed away. He deeply feared that private, informal arrangements linked to Camilla, her specific household staff, or her extended non-royal family members could stealthily become permanent, unshakable obligations for his own future reign, creating an impenetrable shadow court he could not control or dismantle without causing a massive public scandal. To the Prince of Wales, the decision to cut her from the continuity line wasn't born out of petty historical revenge for the pain of his late mother. It was a cold, calculated, and entirely necessary clean break designed specifically to protect Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis from inherited agreements, financial obligations, and personnel structures they had absolutely never approved of. And truthfully, that is actually a very reasonable, pragmatic constitutional concern when you step back from the emotional family drama, the tabloid headlines, and look at it strictly through the lens of a future head of state preparing to navigate an increasingly complex modern world. If informal privileges, vague advisory roles, and expansive charitable networks are simply allowed to continue automatically from one reign to the next without a hard reset, you are essentially inheriting someone else's entrenched power structure without ever officially consenting to it, which is a perfect recipe for institutional disaster and internal warfare. William wanted to guarantee that his highly anticipated reign started with a completely clean slate, driven entirely by his own sovereign choices, his own trusted staff, and his own modern vision for the monarchy, not weighed down by obligations fundamentally baked into the system by his stepmother's ambitious private office. Charles remained completely alone in the echoing council chamber long after the other officials and his son had departed, placing one trembling hand on the empty wooden chair beside him and feeling the crushing, suffocating weight of what had just transpired under his watch as sovereign. The king genuinely loves his wife, a fact that absolutely nobody in the royal orbit seriously disputes anymore despite the turbulent history, but as a monarch, he also inherently knows that his heir's strategic fears cannot simply be dismissed, ignored, or overridden without catastrophic, long-lasting consequences for the bloodline. Ignoring William's demands and siding entirely with Camilla might have instantly created an unprecedented constitutional battle between the currently reigning monarch and the future one, sparking a conflict powerful and bitter enough to irreparably divide the family, leak into the press, and destabilize the institution long before the succession even began. So, Charles found himself impossibly stuck between his deep, human instinct to protect the woman he loves, and his absolute, divine sovereign duty to preserve a stable, unified transition to his son, realizing with quiet horror that those two vital objectives had somehow become completely mutually exclusive. Meanwhile, Camilla sat isolated in her private sitting room with the unsigned, devastating briefing papers resting on the table before her. She slowly removed a priceless royal brooch from her dress and placed it deliberately beside the file, her mind racing through the layers of the betrayal. She was undoubtedly furious with William's cold calculation and ruthless execution, but she knew the deeper, more profound wound belonged entirely to Charles, because he had cowardly allowed her to walk into that council room completely without warning, knowing full well she would hear the life-altering decision broadcasted in front of a room full of staring staff members who would soon gossip about her downfall. That isn't just a high-level policy disagreement or a complex constitutional maneuver. That is a husband letting his wife be publicly ambushed, stripped of her agency, and humiliated because he lacked the fundamental courage to face her wrath in private before the gavel fell. While Camilla sat in the quiet ruin of her future, William was already several steps ahead, meticulously reviewing the confidential draft of the new palace structure again, noting that several high-profile duties, coveted patronages, and transition powers were already explicitly marked for immediate transfer to Catherine, the Princess of Wales, proving the sweeping changes were far larger, more systematic, and more deeply planned than Camilla had initially realized. It was then that Charles discovered a private, handwritten note buried deep in his files, showing he had actually fought desperately behind the scenes to soften William's original, much harsher proposal, trying to at least preserve her ceremonial dignity and transition timeline, but Camilla answered his weak, posthumous defense with a single, devastating handwritten message delivered straight to his office: "Come without your aids." Tell me whose decision this truly was. The inevitable, explosive confrontation between husband and wife was finally coming, but its true underlying cause began with one buried, seemingly innocuous moment 6 weeks earlier that absolutely no one in the inner circle had forgotten, a moment that lit the fuse for this entire constitutional explosion. The massive decision to rewrite the royal future didn't start with a dramatic legal document or a formal parliamentary vote. It started quietly inside a private Windsor meeting where one specific sentence proposed by Camilla transformed William's long-standing suspicion into open, aggressive, and highly organized resistance. Camilla had entered that meeting fully expecting quick, rubber-stamp approval for what she deemed a harmless, practical administrative arrangement, while William left that exact same meeting entirely convinced that the future crown was being quietly, systematically surrounded by loyalists who did not answer to him and who planned to hold power long after his father was gone. Charles had desperately attempted to calm them both down and find a workable middle ground, but the psychological damage had already been irreversibly done. From that defining moment forward, every silence between them became evidence of a plot, every signature became a perceived threat, and any lingering familial trust vanished completely into the ether. Here is what Camilla had actually specifically proposed that set the entire palace machinery on fire and triggered the heir's defensive instincts. She wanted to formally create a continuity role for her team, which was basically designed to grant temporary, consultative access intended to keep her palace work, her charities, and her staff stable when one reign eventually ended and another officially began. Her core argument was logical on paper and presented as a stabilizing force. She insisted that her private office could seamlessly guide charities, manage staff transitions, and handle ceremonial commitments during the historically difficult, emotionally charged period between Charles's inevitable passing and William's full, official assumption of total sovereign control. To her, this proposal was a necessary safety net, a layer of protection against institutional confusion, media speculation, and operational chaos during a time of profound national mourning. But to William, reading the fine print with the critical eye of a future king, it looked exactly like an unauthorized shadow authority aggressively trying to survive past its rightful, constitutional limit and embed itself into his era. When William reached the specific supporting clause in her proposal, he read it twice in utter disbelief. The provision legally allowed selected senior advisors from Camilla's private charitable foundation to continue actively working from royal premises, utilizing royal resources, and operating under the royal banner for a full 12 months after the king's reign ended. So William looked directly at his father and asked, with a voice that stayed remarkably controlled but dripped with unmistakable righteous future king anger, why people chosen exclusively by his stepmother should have any right to remain entrenched inside the palace walls, wielding influence, after he became the reigning monarch. Charles immediately jumped to defend his wife, insisting passionately that her years of relentless public service, her endurance of horrific media scrutiny, and her steadfast loyalty to the crown had earned her a basic level of security, respect, and a highly dignified transition out of power that didn't feel like an eviction. He reminded his son that Camilla had stood beside him through decades of intense criticism and had dutifully carried out unglamorous engagements that others in the family had flatly refused to touch, arguing her dedication demanded reward. William didn't deny her historical contribution or her work ethic. He simply answered, with devastating, unassailable constitutional logic, that personal dignity was not the same thing as inherited authority, making the monarch suddenly and painfully understand that his marriage and his succession were pulling the crown in completely opposite directions and that a choice was unavoidable. Camilla, sensing the tide turning against her and her legacy hanging in the balance, slid the draft document directly toward William and stated firmly that the crown does not simply begin again just because the throne changes hands, implying her work must be respected and carried forward. William coolly closed the document, pushed it firmly back across the table, and replied with absolute finality, "Under me it must." That icy exchange became the absolute point of no return for the Prince of Wales, prompting him to quietly but aggressively commission a highly confidential audit, a private, rigorous review designed specifically to identify, isolate, and catalog every single informal privilege, financial tie, and advisory role that might attempt to continue beyond Charles's reign without the next sovereign's explicit approval. And this is exactly where Princess Anne enters the story in a massive, game-changing way, quietly joining the high-level discussions and warning William in a documented, highly classified private memorandum that blurred lines of power could create dangerous rival loyalties, deeply weakening the authority of the incoming monarch and plunging the institution into chaos. Her crucial, unwavering support gave William the ultimate institutional credibility he desperately needed to execute this purge, because Princess Anne's reputation is basically unimpeachable when it comes to duty, discipline, and protecting the crown above all personal feelings or family dynamics. Palace officials and Charles himself couldn't simply dismiss the sweeping review as William's personal, lingering childhood resentment regarding his mother when the highly respected Princess Royal was actively backing it with formal, written constitutional advice that aligned perfectly with the survival of the monarchy. Camilla unfortunately discovered the painful truth of this powerful alliance just 3 days before the disastrous emergency meeting when she accidentally found the words Operation Clearline printed inside a misfiled household scheduling dossier, instantly understanding that William had moved aggressively from passive resistance to full-scale institutional action aimed directly at dismantling her future. By the time she furiously summoned Charles to speak with her completely alone, the argument was no longer about one specific clause in a transition document. It was a fundamental, existential battle about whether he had actively protected his wife or cowardly surrendered her entire future to appease his son and secure his own legacy. Charles entered Camilla's sitting room without a single equerry, bodyguard, or private advisor to shield him, finding her standing rigidly beside the fireplace with the damning palace document open in both of her hands, her expression a mix of fury and heartbreak. For several agonizing seconds, neither of them spoke a word, the silence heavier than any screaming match, until she finally asked him point-blank whether he had known about the plot to erase her from the royal future. The king hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that tiny, agonizing hesitation answered absolutely everything she needed to know. What followed wasn't a polite constitutional discussion between a sovereign and his consort, but a brutal, emotionally raw confrontation between a husband who had fatally compromised and a wife who believed the very man she had defended against the world had allowed the crown to completely erase her existence. Charles shamefully admitted that he had formally received the final recommendation from the council 48 hours earlier, the formal, binding advice sent to the sovereign before a major structural decision, setting out exactly what the top palace officials believed must happen next to secure the institution against internal threats. He pleaded that he had spent those 2 sleepless days desperately trying to soften the harsh legal language, attempting to protect Camilla's ceremonial position, and trying to stop the executive order from becoming a complete, humiliating exclusion of her legacy. The king frantically insisted that he had fought for her behind closed doors, but all she heard was that he had ultimately failed her in silence, allowing the ruthless machinery of the state to roll completely over her while he stood by and watched. Camilla rejected his weak distinction immediately, stating fiercely that remaining physically beside Charles at grand ceremonies meant absolutely nothing if every single part of her actual authority, influence, and protection disappeared the exact moment his reign ended, leaving her totally vulnerable to a court that didn't want her. The Queen firmly believed that the palace, and by extension Charles, wanted her grueling service without guaranteeing her future, demanded her loyalty without offering protection, and expected her public smile without providing any lasting place for the people, charities, or causes she had built around herself over 20 years. She stepped aggressively closer, pressing the thick document directly against Charles's chest, and told him, "You let them erase me while asking me to keep smiling beside you." A statement so painfully true that Charles gripped the folder, but couldn't formulate an answer at once, fully absorbing the sting of his own betrayal. Then, stripping away the royal facade, the king confessed what had truly frightened him the most. He admitted that outright rejecting the council's recommendation might have pushed William completely out of the transition planning process, halting the vital private work that prepares the heir to assume full control when the throne eventually changes hands. He confessed that he had chosen institutional unity with his son because a broken, hostile succession could irreparably damage the monarchy itself, admitting he knew that choice would deeply wound Camilla, but he had made it anyway for the sake of the crown, sacrificing her on the altar of stability. Camilla demanded to know whether William himself had personally written the final devastating clause. Charles said no, but his pained face betrayed the deeper, harsher truth. The prince had aggressively insisted on its central, unyielding principle, that absolutely nothing linked to her private network would automatically survive into his reign. The king then revealed the final, crushing piece of pressure through a documented conversation recorded in his private briefing notes. Anne had warned him directly that allowing two rival centers of loyalty to exist could tear the family apart during a vulnerable succession, and the Princess Royal's stark words had finally convinced him the review could no longer be stopped. Hearing this, Camilla quietly removed the small, priceless crown-shaped pin Charles had personally given her right after their coronation, placed it deliberately beside his hand on the table, and flatly informed him that she would not attend the highly publicized evening state reception, a devastating boycott that would inevitably alert the press to the fracture. Charles looked at the discarded pin, then at his fiercely proud wife, and promised to confront William personally, not to reverse the decision, because he knew that was impossible, but to discover exactly how far the aggressive restructuring of the palace had already gone and what else he had lost control of. The king left her in complete silence and walked directly through the winding corridors toward the heir, who was already systematically redrawing the entire palace structure around a future reign that had not yet begun. William didn't receive his father in a grand, intimidating chamber. He waited calmly in a small, utilitarian palace office with only two specific folders and a handwritten list resting on the desk, a visual simplicity that unsettled Charles far more than any grand ceremony would have, because this wasn't a rebellion performed for an audience. It was a completed, airtight strategy ready for execution. The prince had already ruthlessly examined royal appointments, grace and favor residences, charitable foundations, advisory privileges, and private access lists, meaning Camilla's removal from the royal line of continuity wasn't the entire decision at all. It was merely the first, most visible consequence of a massive institutional purge designed to consolidate power entirely within his own household. William fundamentally understood the strict limits of his present constitutional power. As merely the heir, he knew he couldn't rewrite Charles's current reign, he couldn't remove the Queen from her present, daily duties, and he couldn't command the monarch's active household staff without violating protocol. But succession planning, the highly confidential private work of preparing for the next reign, gave him an entirely different, incredibly potent kind of authority, allowing him to outright refuse to inherit informal commitments and to aggressively separate temporary permissions from the core responsibilities that the future crown would be legally expected to continue. Princess Anne had significantly strengthened that exact position, firmly believing that continuity should solely protect the monarchy itself, not preserve the personal networks, friends, or favorites cultivated around one specific royal figure who would eventually depart the main stage. Her documented, highly respected advice easily persuaded nervous, career-minded officials that William's campaign wasn't simply a petty emotional attack on his stepmother, but a necessary disciplined boundary that was far harder for Charles to dismiss as mere family drama, painting it instead as essential statecraft. Charles looked at his resolute son and asked the haunting question that had followed him from his wife's sitting room. Was this massive purge truly about constitutional clarity, or was it simply old, deep-seated anger wearing the respectable language of duty to finally exact revenge? William's jaw visibly tightened as the king spoke the exact fear neither man had ever wanted named out loud. The tragic past had never truly disappeared. It had merely learned to sit quietly and patiently inside every single conversation they ever had about the future of the family. William flatly refused to apologize, stating with absolute conviction that he would not allow George, Charlotte, and Louis to inherit a palace deeply divided by promises they had never made, ensuring his children would not begin their public lives trapped inside complex arrangements created before they were even old enough to understand them, vowing to break the cycle of royal dysfunction. Charles heard absolutely no cruelty or malice in his son's voice, which made the finality of the situation even more frightening because William was operating entirely on cold, institutional logic, devoid of the messy emotions that had governed Charles's own life. Catherine, however, had already questioned the severe human cost of this maneuver. Before the meeting, the Princess of Wales had gently asked William whether protecting the crown truly required publicly humiliating Camilla in front of the entire household staff, an act that bordered on unnecessary cruelty. He had paused before answering her, still firmly believing the decision was constitutionally right, but she had forced him to silently admit that the orchestrated walkout had become something far harsher and more vindictive than the policy itself required, showing a crack in his armor. William then opened the second folder on his desk, revealing the sealed page that explicitly named Catherine and Anne as the joint, immediate recipients of all of Camilla's stripped transition responsibilities, with final, absolute authority resting entirely with the reigning monarch or the direct heir, effectively cutting the Queen out of the loop forever.